Chapter 1. The Day I Was Erased. They fired me in a glass boardroom in front of people who had built their careers on my work, and they thought that was the end of the story. What they did not know was that one clause they signed years earlier would shut down their biggest demo, expose their leadership, and force them to beg for help they no longer deserved. I am Alara, and this is not a story about anger or revenge. It is about what happens when silence turns out to be the most dangerous move in the room. I arrived at the glass tower in downtown Seattle the same way I had for more than a decade, coffee cooling in my hand, badge resting against my palm like a familiar coin. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and roasted beans from the cafe on the corner. It was early enough that the elevators were still forgiving, doors opening before I reached for the button. I noticed the quiet first. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows a held breath. I had been with Lattice Harbor for 11 years, long enough that the security desk no longer asked for my name, long enough that I knew which elevator stalled for half a second between floors, long enough that I could tell when something was off by the way people avoided my eyes. That morning, heads dipped. Conversations cut short. A few faces offered tight smiles that did not quite land. My phone vibrated as the elevator climbed. A short message from Executive Operations asking me to come to the boardroom immediately. No context, no greeting. I stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped the phone back into my bag. I told myself it was another alignment meeting, another conversation about roadmaps and timelines. I told myself not to read into the quiet. The boardroom sat at the end of the west corridor, walls of clear glass looking out over the Sound. When I pushed the door open, everyone was already seated. That alone was unusual. Meetings rarely started without a bit of small talk, a late arrival, a shuffle of papers. This room was still. Ethan Rowe sat at the head of the table, jacket pressed, tablet angled toward him like a shield. He was 44, confident in the way men get when their confidence has not yet been tested. To his right sat Paula Grant, our CFO, her hands folded over a leather notebook she never opened. Across from her was Simon Alvarez from Legal, posture straight, eyes fixed on a point just above my shoulder. At the far end, Denise Holloway, the board chair, watched me with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. There was an empty chair near the door. Mine. I took my seat and placed my notebook on the table out of habit, aligning it with the edge, a small order in a room that felt tilted. Ethan did not waste time. He spoke about restructuring, about the next phase, about the need for a different leadership profile. The words came out smooth, practiced, the kind of language that sounds thoughtful until you realize it means nothing at all. He said my role as principal systems architect was being eliminated effective immediately. He said the company appreciated my contributions. He said this was not personal. No one interrupted him. No one asked a question. Paula did not look up. Simon kept his hands folded. Denise did not nod or shake her head. The silence pressed in. I waited for the part where someone explained how this decision had been reached. I waited for a mention of transition planning, of handover, of the teams I still led. None of that came. There was no human resources representative in the room, no envelope, just a statement delivered as if it were an update to a slide deck. I felt the familiar urge rise, the instinct to correct the record, to point out the systems I had built, the nights I had stayed late to keep them running, the risks I had absorbed so others could move faster. I felt the urge to ask how a vision could exist without the infrastructure beneath it. I let the urge pass. Instead, I said, "Thank you." The word surprised me as it left my mouth, not because I didn't mean it, but because of how it landed. Ethan blinked. Paula finally looked up. Someone shifted in their chair. I closed my notebook, slid it into my bag, and stood. The sound of the chair legs against the floor was louder than it should have been. No one stood with me. No one offered a hand. I nodded once toward the table, not in deference, but in acknowledgement, and walked out. The hallway felt longer on the way back. The glass walls reflected a woman I barely recognized, composed, steady, shoulders squared. I passed familiar desks, screens glowing with code I had reviewed only days earlier. A few people glanced up, then away. One engineer opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. I did not slow down. Outside, the air was damp, the kind of gray morning Seattle does best. I crossed the street without checking the light and kept walking until the tower was just another shape behind me. My phone buzzed again. I did not look. I thought about the first day I had walked into that building years ago, nervous and determined, carrying a box of books and a belief that good work spoke for itself. I thought about the years in between, the promotions that came quietly, the systems that scaled because they had to, not because anyone asked them to. I thought about how often I had been told I was reliable, how rarely I had been told I was essential. By the time I reached the corner, my hands had stopped shaking. The city moved around me, buses hissing, footsteps passing, life continuing as it always does. I realized something then, standing on the curb with my bag heavy at my side. They believed they had erased me from the picture. They believed the room they controlled was the whole world. What they did not remember was how carefully some decisions are made, how many signatures are gathered in moments of urgency, how certain documents outlast the people who forget them. I turned toward the waterfront and kept walking, letting the morning carry me forward, knowing there were details still unfolding, threads not yet pulled, and a silence that had only just begun to speak.
Chapter 2. When silence was louder than betrayal. The walk along the water ended sooner than I expected, not because I ran out of distance, but because my body needed a place to stop. I drove home without thinking, muscle memory taking over, freeway exits blurring together until I pulled into the narrow driveway of my townhouse on the north end of Tacoma. The house was quiet in a way it never had been on a weekday morning. No calendar alerts chiming, no messages stacking up while I was in transit, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. I set my bag down by the door and stood there longer than necessary, keys still in my hand. For years, home had been the place where I caught my breath between meetings. Now it felt like neutral ground, not refuge, not exile, just space. I opened my laptop out of habit. The familiar login screen appeared, then disappeared, replaced by a message informing me that my credentials were no longer valid. I tried my email next. Same result. The calendar that had once been a patchwork of colors and obligations was empty, my name removed as cleanly as if it had never been there. An hour later, the offboarding email arrived. It was brief and polite, thanking me for my service, confirming that my access had been revoked, outlining next steps for returning company property. The subject line read, "Separation complete." I read it twice, then once more, not because it was unclear, but because seeing the finality in writing carried a different weight. This was not just an awkward meeting or a misunderstanding. This was a door closed and locked. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The urge to call someone rose again, the same instinct I had felt in the boardroom, to explain, to be understood. I reached for my phone instead. My mother answered on the third ring. Her voice was calm, steady, the way it had always been. I told her what had happened, keeping my tone even, listing facts as if that would keep emotion at bay. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. She said that maybe it was for the best, that I had worked so hard for so long, that sometimes these things happened for reasons we could not see yet. She said I should not make a scene, that companies had ways of dealing with people who caused trouble. She reminded me that I had done well, that I had nothing to prove. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat there for a while after, phone resting in my palm, feeling the familiar sting of disappointment. She had not meant to dismiss me, she had meant to protect me, but protection and erasure often looked the same from the outside. I called my ex-husband next, not because I expected comfort, but because I needed to hear another voice. He picked up quickly. I told him the same story. He responded with sympathy, then suggested that maybe I had been pushing myself too hard, that slowing down could be good for me. He asked what I planned to do next. I said I did not know yet. That was the truth. We ended the call politely, like two people who had learned how to step around old landmines. The messages from work came later, quietly, one by one. A senior engineer I had mentored sent a short note saying he was sorry, that this felt wrong, but that he hoped I understood why he could not say more. Another message came from a project manager asking if I could still share notes on a system transition. I did not respond. One message stood out. It was from Meena Patel, a back-end engineer who had been with the company almost as long as I had. She wrote that she was scared, that seeing me gone made her realize how little protection any of us really had. She apologized for not speaking up. I told her she did not need to apologize. Fear was not a moral failing, it was a survival instinct. Not all messages carried regret. Later that afternoon, I ran into a former colleague at the grocery store. He asked how retirement was treating me, a half smile on his face. I told him I was adjusting. He nodded, as if that confirmed something he already believed. By the evening, exhaustion settled in, not the kind that followed long hours or tight deadlines, but a deeper fatigue, the kind that came from holding yourself together when the world had decided to move on without you. I poured a glass of water and sat back down at my desk. This time, I did not try to log in. Instead, I opened an old folder on an external drive I kept disconnected most of the time. Inside were archived emails, contracts, drafts, documents I had saved because experience had taught me that memory was not enough. I did not open them with anger. I opened them with curiosity. As I scrolled, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a junior developer named Lucas Grant. He was new, still learning the architecture, still asking questions that others were too proud to ask. He wrote that he was trying to understand an old licensing structure tied to a core module, and that he could not find the original documentation internally. He asked if I remembered how it worked. I stared at the message longer than I had any right to. It would have been easy to ignore it, easy to say that I was no longer responsible. But the question itself told me something important. Things were already unraveling. I typed a brief reply, saying that I remembered, that I would look into it, that I would get back to him. I set the phone down and leaned back, feeling a shift inside me. Not resolve, not triumph, just clarity. The silence around me had not come from agreement or acceptance. It had come from fear, from convenience, from the belief that removing one person would keep the rest of the structure intact. Sitting there, surrounded by the quiet of a life abruptly slowed, I understood that silence was not empty. It was full of information if you knew how to listen. Outside, the light was fading, the sky turning the color it did just before rain. I closed the folder without making any decisions yet. There was no rush. Whatever came next would come because the pieces were already in motion, not because I forced it. I stood up, turned on the kitchen light, and let the evening settle in, knowing that the pause I was in was not an ending, but the space before something shifted.
Chapter 3. The Clause Everyone Forgot. The quiet of the kitchen did not last long. Once the light was on, the room felt smaller, as if it were waiting for me to decide what kind of night this would be. I poured a cup of tea and sat back at the desk, the same one where I had worked late nights when the systems were fragile and the stakes were high. Back then, every decision felt urgent. Now, urgency had been replaced by clarity. I pulled the external drive closer and connected it to my laptop. The folders opened slowly, years of history stacked in neat digital rows. I did not go searching at random. I knew exactly where to look. In 2019, Lattice Harbor had been in trouble. Not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that kept executives awake at night. Costs were climbing faster than revenue. Legal exposure was becoming harder to ignore. Our core platform had grown powerful but also complicated, tied too closely to internal oversight. That was when the board had called me in. I remembered the meeting clearly.
Ethan Rowe had been new then, still careful with his words, still listening more than he spoke. Paula Grant had spread spreadsheets across the table, numbers highlighted in red. Simon Alvarez from legal had leaned back in his chair and said the quiet part out loud. We need to reduce risk. We need separation. Denise Holloway had turned to me and asked if there was a way to restructure without dismantling the system. I had said there was, but it would require trust. I explained a vendor model, one where the core architecture would be licensed through a separate entity. It would protect the company, reduce liability, and give us flexibility if the market shifted. It was not unusual. Plenty of firms did it. The key was oversight. Paula had asked who would run it. I said I would. The emails were still there, approval threads stretching over weeks, legal reviews, budget notes. Eventually, a short message from Denise confirming the decision. Proceed. That was how North Shore Systems LLC came into existence, not as a personal project, but as a solution the board had requested. The contracts were clear. The license allowed Lattice Harbor to use the platform under specific conditions. Oversight was defined. Renewal cycles were established. There was even a clause that Simon had insisted on, something he called a safety net. If oversight was terminated, rights reverted. At the time, it had felt academic. No one imagined a scenario where I would be removed overnight. We signed, filed, and moved on. The system stabilized, costs dropped, the crisis passed, and like most things that work quietly, the structure faded into the background. Now, sitting in my kitchen years later, that background came sharply into focus. I scrolled to the contract and read the clause again, slower this time. Reversion upon termination of oversight. The language was unambiguous. Oversight was tied to my role. My role had been terminated publicly and immediately. My phone buzzed. A text from Lucas Grant asking if I had found anything. I did not reply yet. Instead, I called an attorney I had worked with once before, a woman named Rachel Kim. She specialized in intellectual property and did not waste time with reassurance. When she answered, I told her I needed a consultation and that it was time-sensitive. We met the next morning at her office in Bellevue. The building was understated, the kind that did not advertise its importance. Rachel listened as I laid out the situation, sliding printed copies of emails and contracts across the table. She read without interrupting, marking sections with a pen. When she finished, she leaned back and looked at me carefully. You are on solid ground, she said, but solid does not mean safe. I asked her what she meant. She said that legally the structure was sound. The company asked for it. The board had approved it. The language was clean. But optics mattered. If Lattice Harbor stumbled publicly, there would be pressure to assign blame, and I was no longer inside the building. They could claim sabotage, she said. Even if it doesn't stick, it would be loud. I asked her what she would do. She said she would move slowly, let the process unfold. Do not touch anything that could be construed as interference. Let the system do exactly what it was designed to do. I left her office with a folder of notes and a heavier awareness of the risk. This was not a button I could press without consequence. It was a lever, and once pulled, it could not be pushed back. That afternoon, I drove past the Lattice Harbor campus without stopping. The parking lot was full. Life inside the walls continued as if I had never been there. I wondered how many people inside still assumed I was a phone call away. At home, I checked the system status from my side, not making changes, just observing. The license server was stable. Renewal was scheduled in 90 days. Nothing was broken, nothing was forced. Another message came in from Lucas. We're prepping for the Palo Alto demo. Some dependencies are acting weird. Do you remember if there were any conditions tied to oversight? I closed my eyes for a moment before replying. I said yes, there were, and that I would explain soon. The demo loomed large in the company calendar. It was meant to reassure investors, to show that everything was under control after recent changes. Ethan had been vocal about it. He wanted a clean narrative, a fresh start. I understood then what timing meant. Not revenge, not intervention, but alignment. Systems did not fail out of spite. They failed when conditions changed. That evening, I spread the documents across my dining table, not in panic, but in preparation. I highlighted dates, I noted signatures, I wrote down questions for Rachel. I did not contact the company. I did not warn anyone. As night settled in, the house grew quiet again. I felt the weight of the choice in front of me, the kind that does not announce itself as right or wrong, only as inevitable. Somewhere inside the system, a clock was ticking, not because I said it, but because it had always been there. I turned off the light and left the papers where they were. Tomorrow, the company would move closer to its moment on stage, and I would continue to wait, not in silence this time, but with full awareness of what silence was about to reveal.
Chapter 4. Their Failure, Not My Revenge. The day of the demo arrived without ceremony. I knew it had started not because I was there, but because my phone began to vibrate in small, uneven bursts on the kitchen counter. Notifications from industry newsletters, a calendar reminder I had forgotten to delete, a message from Lucas that simply said they were setting up. I did not open the live stream right away. I made coffee. I washed the mug by hand. I let the minutes pass the way I had learned to let them pass over the years. When I finally sat down and opened the feed, the room on the screen looked exactly as I remembered it. Bright glass walls, long table, rows of chairs filled with people whose attention had weight attached to it. Ethan Rowe stood at the front of the room, jacket off, sleeves rolled in a way meant to signal confidence. He smiled easily and spoke about stability, about continuity, about how recent changes had strengthened the company. His voice carried the calm rhythm of someone who believed the story he was telling. I recognized faces in the audience, investors who had asked hard questions before, board members sitting slightly apart, hands folded, eyes alert. Paula Grant leaned forward, elbows on the table, listening. Simon Alvarez sat still, unreadable. Denise Holloway watched Ethan with a faint expression I could not place. The demo began smoothly. Screens lit up. Graphs moved the way they were supposed to. I felt a strange sense of distance, as if I were watching a replay of a game I had once played, now being run by someone else. Then, the screen froze. For a moment, no one spoke. A cursor blinked. A message appeared, small and precise. License authorization expired. A murmur rippled through the room. Engineers leaned toward each other. Someone tapped a keyboard. Ethan laughed lightly, a sound meant to defuse tension. "Looks like we are having a brief hiccup," he said. I watched his hands. They were steady, but his eyes flicked to the side, searching. The feed cut to a holding slide. Paula whispered something to an engineer. Simon shifted in his chair. After a few minutes, Ethan returned to the microphone. "We have resolved the issue," he said. "Thank you for your patience." The demo restarted. For less than a minute, it held. Then the system stopped again. This time, there was no slide, no transition, just a hard stop and the same message, clear and impossible to misinterpret. License authorization expired. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before. This was not confusion. This was recognition. I saw it in the way Denise straightened, in the way Paula pressed her lips together, in the way Simon finally looked down at his phone. Ethan tried to speak, but his words came slower now. "We're going to take a short break," he said. The camera feed cut. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. My phone rang not long after. I did not answer. A text followed from an unknown number asking if I was available to talk. I set the phone face down and returned to the screen. When the feed resumed, the room had changed. People stood in small clusters. Voices were lower. The confidence had drained from the space, replaced by calculation. Ethan spoke to Denise with a tight expression. Paula rubbed her temples. Simon was already flipping through documents. Later that afternoon, the narrative shifted online. Articles began to appear questioning the readiness of Lattice Harbor after its recent leadership changes. One headline mentioned instability, another mentioned risk. By evening, a longer piece went live. Evan Brooks had written it. He framed the story carefully, noting the technical failure, the unanswered questions, the timing. He mentioned me by name, not accusing, but suggesting. He described me as difficult, as rigid, as someone who had resisted change. I read it once, then closed the browser. I had expected this. When systems fail, people look for faces to attach to the failure. I was an easy one. A message came through from Lucas. "Everything is locked down," he wrote. "Legal is freaking out." I typed back a single line telling him to stay calm and follow instructions. It was the last message I sent that day. The next call came from a number I recognized, Lattice Harbor. I let it ring. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end was careful, almost deferential. They asked if I was willing to talk. They said they needed clarity. They said there had been misunderstandings. I listened without interrupting. I did not agree to anything. I did not explain. I said I would consider a conversation and ended the call. As night settled in, I sat alone at the table, the same documents spread out in front of me, unchanged. Outside, rain began to fall, steady and unremarkable. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of anger. What I felt was confirmation. The system had done what it was designed to do, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of alignment. The company had changed the conditions, the outcome had followed. My phone buzzed again with another call I did not answer. I turned it off and sat in the quiet, knowing that the questions being asked on the other end of the line were only just beginning, and that whatever came next would not be about fixing a demo, but about facing the consequences of forgetting what had already been agreed to.
Chapter 5. The Life That Didn't Need Them. Morning came quietly, as if the city itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I woke without an alarm and lay still for a while, listening to rain move along the windows. The calls from the night before had stopped. In their place were emails, carefully worded, each one asking for time, for conversation, for clarity. I did not open them right away. By noon, I agreed to meet. Not at the office, not at my home, but in a small conference room at a neutral co-working space near the water. 2 representatives from Lattice Harbor arrived together, one from legal, one from operations. They smiled the way people do when they know they need something but are not ready to say it out loud. They started with apologies. They said the situation had escalated faster than anyone expected. They said the demo failure had raised concerns that needed immediate resolution. They said my experience was still highly valued. Then they made the offer. A new title, broader authority, a compensation package that was meant to sound generous, equity, control over architecture decisions, a promise that things would be different this time. I listened without interrupting, hands folded in my lap, posture relaxed. When they finished, they waited, eyes searching my face for a reaction they could work with. I told them I appreciated the clarity. I told them I understood why they were asking, and then I said no. Not sharply, not with anger, just no. I explained that returning would not fix what had already been revealed. The problem was not my position or my title. The problem was the assumption that stability could be preserved by removing the person who understood the system best. Going back would only reset the cycle, not end it. They tried once more, this time leaning into urgency. Legal risk, market perception, the need for alignment. I stood, thanked them for their time, and ended the meeting. As I walked out, I felt something settle inside me. It was not victory, it was relief. The calls slowed after that. The emails became shorter, then stopped altogether. The company shifted its focus to containment, to messaging, to damage control. Ethan Rowe resigned within weeks, framed publicly as a mutual decision.
Paula Grant stayed, tasked with restoring confidence. Simon Alvarez disappeared from press releases entirely. I heard these things secondhand. I did not look them up. At home, life adjusted in smaller ways. My mother called again, her tone different now. She asked how I was doing, not what I planned to do. My ex-husband suggested coffee, then admitted he had always underestimated how much my work mattered to me. I listened, accepted the words for what they were, and did not rush to rebuild anything that had been quiet for too long. Messages came from former colleagues. Meena Patel told me she had updated her resume. Others asked for advice, for references, for perspective. I gave what I could, when I could, without stepping back into the role I had left. Caleb Monroe sent a note apologizing for things he had said and assumed. He asked if I would be open to mentoring outside the company. I told him we would see. North Shore Systems grew steadily, not explosively. That was intentional. I took on projects that made sense, worked with teams that understood boundaries, signed agreements that reflected lessons learned. Oversight was clear. Expectations were written down. Silence was never mistaken for consent. Some evenings I walked along the water again, not to escape, but to think. I thought about how often we confuse endurance with loyalty, how often we stay because leaving feels like failure. I thought about how easily a room can decide you are done and how quietly you can decide otherwise. I never felt the need to celebrate what happened. There was no moment of triumph waiting for me at the end of it. What there was, instead, was space. Space to choose how I spent my time. Space to define my work on my terms. Space to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. Looking back, the most powerful part of the story was not the collapse or the offers that followed. It was the silence before any of that happened, the pause that forced everyone to confront what they had taken for granted. Silence, I learned, is not absence. It is a mirror. If you were listening to this and thinking about a moment when you stayed quiet, when you let a room move on without you, ask yourself why. Was it fear or was it preparation? And if the silence you are in right now feels heavy, consider what it might be holding. Sometimes the strongest move is not to speak at all, but to wait until the truth has no choice but to speak for itself.